I'm now thrilled to introduce Brad Ack, who is the CEO of Ocean Visions. And Brad has really spent his whole career working at the intersection of technology, science, and policy, which is really what we need now to go to scale, and has been doing a lot with leading edge conservation and sustainable development initiatives globally. Now, Ocean Visions, you'll tell us more about that, I know, Brad, but I have been to a number of your fantastic events during climate weeks and just very grateful about the ecosystem that you've been building. Thank you so much for moderating this panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Brad Ack, the CEO of an organization called Ocean Visions. And I'll just give you, I'm going to break the mold here of the sessions before, and that I was asked to also give a slide presentation and to moderate at the same time. So Ocean Visions is a relatively new organization that is comprised of a series of partners in the ocean sciences and academic sciences arena, dedicated collectively to trying to advance very quickly on solutions to what we see as the most critical problem facing the ocean. And most people, when I say that, will immediately think of something like plastics or fisheries, but in fact, this is what we see as the most significant problem facing the ocean. You heard John earlier talk about millions and millions of years of climate data. I'll just go back 800,000 years. This is a plot of atmospheric carbon over the last 800,000 years, fluctuating between about 170 parts per million and 300 parts per million. And that's in and out of glacial periods over long periods of time. And then you get to the end, the far right of that graph, and you just see this rocket ride up that is not discontinuing. And so in the last 150 years, we've added about 50% more CO2 to the atmosphere than was ever in it in the last 800,000. And if you think that the planet, the way it looks right now, has caught up to that, like that the response time is in real time, of course, that's not the case, right? This is a geologic blink of the eye. And even if we were to stop emitting carbon tomorrow, the carbon would persist in the atmosphere for a very long time, causing continuing damage and probably leading to even more carbon in the atmosphere from the release of land-based sources or other greenhouse gases. Now, why is this an ocean problem? Because the single biggest stress to the ocean is thermal. We are pouring in around 14 zettajoules of heat into the ocean every year. Probably not a lot of you know what a zettajoule is, but it's a joule, which is a basic unit of energy with 21 zeros after it. It's 14 zettajoules is 30 times more than all of the heat we produce on the planet. And we're driving it in exchange for that amount of heat that we produce, we're trapping 30 times more, driving it into the ocean with a host of really dangerous effects. And these outstrip and outweigh plastics or overfishing or any other impact to the ocean. Not that those are not important, but these eventually become irreversible. And this number scarily has been not a straight line increase. It's actually been increasing more rapidly than what we projected. And in fact, there's been some recent papers about the energy imbalance on the planet increasing more rapidly than any of the models have predicted. And they don't actually know exactly why. So this is something to be very concerned about. And then the second big stress from too much CO2 in the atmosphere is that much of it absorbs into the upper layer of the ocean. This is the redistribution of pollution. This is not carbon management. This is pollution in the upper layer of the ocean causing ocean acidification. If we can use tools like similar to what Paul talked about and turn that into carbonates deep in the sea, then it becomes carbon management. But right now it's pollution in the upper layer of the ocean. 30% change to the acidic over the last 180 years. So we've performed a giant chemistry experiment on the ocean in our lifetimes and beyond our lifetimes. And we actually don't know what the outcomes will be. And again, this doesn't turn off until we stop emitting carbon. So at Ocean Visions, we work on what we call an expanded or comprehensive agenda to try to address this issue. The first, and from an ocean-based perspective, because the ocean can play a very large role in helping to ameliorate a number of these problems. So the first way is through reduction. The ocean can contribute to the transition to a low and no carbon economy through marine renewable energy, blue foods, and a host of bioproducts from ocean biology. What we're here to talk about is that the ocean can actually contribute very significantly to the Herculean task we have of cleaning up carbon because of its sheer size and biological functions and chemical processes. But we posit neither of those are guaranteed to arrive in time to forestall dangerous tipping points. And I just came out of the opening session of the Global Tipping Points meeting, which is just up the road, and heard Johan Rockström say that we're now skirting the danger of a climate catastrophe defined as affecting up to 10% of the entire population of the planet, where we are right now with tipping points. And this is not a person who is prone to exaggeration if you've heard him speak before. I've never heard him say that, and he just said it to the assembled audience. So repair is what we can do to slow down tipping points. And we have a bunch of work in the Arctic I'd be happy to talk to you offline about. And then lastly, it's going to take a much broader community of makers and solvers and innovators, much like in this room here, but 10x and 10x and 10x again. So this is our agenda. Very quickly on carbon removal. I think you all know about the role that carbon removal plays in all of the IPCC projections in the transition to net zero. There is no plausible scenario without carbon removal at very, very large scales. So we're talking about somewhere between 7 to 10 gigatons a year by 2050. But over the course of this century, somewhere around 400 to 1,000 gigatons, 1,000 billion tons, otherwise a trillion tons. So it would be the largest it'll be the largest pollution cleanup ever attempted on the planet if we are able to pull it off. Where are we now? This is a graph from a report done by the University of Oxford. I think they're in their second annual year now looking at CDR. And so we're at about 2 billion tons today of CDR, almost entirely from afforestation and other land management. And then that little sliver is what we call novel CDR, which is where most of the growth is going to happen. And you see along the left here, that includes bioenergy, biochar, enhanced rock weathering, and other novel CDR, all in that little, and oceans aren't even in this. Because when they did this the first time around, they didn't even look at what the oceans might contribute. They are changing that now. Why are they changing that? Because the ocean already is the largest cycler of carbon on the planet. And that big blue or purple dot in the middle is the carbon that's in the deep ocean, sequestered over the long term, millions, thousands to potentially millions of years in the form of carbonate and bicarbonate. And it's 50 times more carbon than is in the atmosphere. So if you could increase that by 1%, 2%, you could deal with the problem. And that, I think Paul talked about that as well. It's obviously a huge endeavor, but percentage-wise, it's not that big of an increase. And these are the ways that the ocean can be potentially employed to uptake carbon. They fall into two big categories: biological and abiological. Biological, anything that photosynthesizes gives you the opportunity to potentially capture that carbon in a number of ways, creating long-lived products or sinking the biomass, accelerating its sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And there's some others in that category. And then chemical or abiological are these processes that raise alkalinity that we heard about earlier from Paul from Exeter. He's working on one, direct ocean capture with the return of basewater, but there's a number of other approaches in that category. If you want to learn more about them, we've done deep dive assessments on all of the potential pathways here. They fall into these 5 big categories that are in blue, and then there's 2 what we call roadmaps in green that are about the social and political and financial issues surrounding. You can do a deep dive and learn what we know about these techniques, what we don't know, what we need to know, and get educated. We've also produced a high-level map that lays out what has to happen by 2030. We're in a race to try to understand whether or not these things can work, and then what it will take to scale them. There has been a growth in research around the world, and there's also been a fairly significant growth in the number of actors. And so it's still nowhere where it needs to be. And there has been a bit of a growth in funding, but with an enormous gap now with the United States pulling out of climate action. So that is basically to conclude my part of this, that our current trajectory is not going to get us there. We are going to have to, the scale challenge here is unbelievable, as we've heard from everybody who's spoken. I don't know there is an easily modular approach yet to this, but we're going to have to figure that out, because this is going to have to be done across fairly large parts of the globe. All right, so that is my introduction to the session. We're blessed to have 4 other people who are working on different parts of this equation. And first, we're going to have Alexia Senov, who's the head of Fair Carbon. Previously, she led the biodiversity and regenerative food systems work at the World Economic Forum, and she's managed the East African portfolio of Partnerships for Forests, a DFID-funded program on forest protection and sustainable land use. And before that, she was at McKinsey.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Alexia. I'm with Fair Carbon. I'm delighted to be here today. So I'm going to talk about a technology that has been around for thousands of years that can be found in coastal ecosystems and mangroves. They are cost-effective and deliver a lot of co-benefits for people and nature and climate adaptation as well. So very cool technology. So let me tell you a bit about these coastal ecosystems and these champions that we have around. They are a climate mitigation powerhouse. They can capture up to 10 times more carbon per hectare than terrestrial forests. They're also incredibly important for climate adaptation. I've actually read recently that 100-meter wide mangrove barrier can reduce wave energy by up to 70% and tsunami flooding by 30%, which is pretty incredible. And finally, they're also really important for biodiversity and coastal livelihoods. Up to 75% of fishery stocks depend on mangroves at one point in their lifetime. And this means that they're very important for the fishers and the millions of families that depend on these fishery species around the world. But, yes, there is a but. They are disappearing very fast. It's predicted that if current rates remain unabated, in the next 100 years, all of the mangroves could disappear. This is also really bad for climate change, as it's going to further fuel the problem as it releases all the carbon stocks that were sequestered in their soils for millennia. And it's also bad news for the climate adaptation potential that they have for coastal ecosystems, coastal regions. So what can we do? I know carbon markets are not perfect. They're not the silver bullet we were talking about this morning, but they are the most established mechanism we have today to funnel funding into the protection and restoration of natural ecosystems. They're predicted to grow, there's a typo there, sorry, 125 times, actually, because there are 2 billion today, by 2050. And if done correctly, they could really fund protection of natural ecosystems at scale while being impact-rich and high quality. So the question now is, how can we grow the blue carbon sector or market within the voluntary carbon markets? Because today they only represent 0.2% of the traded carbon credits on those markets, which is really small compared to the potential they could deliver. So this is exactly what we set out to do at Fair Carbon. We aim to accelerate the protection and restoration of coastal ecosystems, and we want to do so by eliminating the technical, financial, and policy barriers that are currently restricting the growth of this market. We are aiming to do so by taking a systemic approach that we've designed by spending hours talking to project developers, scientists, NGOs, corporate buyers, and investors. And basically, this is what we found. Barrier number 1, there is a lack of technical capacity with up to 80% of restoration projects that are today currently failing. Mangroves or coastal ecosystems are not just small forests. They're actually very distinct. They have specific ecological processes which require specific restoration techniques and interventions and special carbon models. So because it's quite early stage for many of these projects, the knowledge is very fragmented and it's incredibly hard to understand. I don't know if any of you have tried reading a Vera methodology, but if you have, you might realize that you might need a PhD to understand it. And there's also very little case studies to learn from for these projects. So what we've done is we developed the Blue Carbon Academy, which is this online learning platform that gives you a step-by-step guide in understandable terms, with tools and templates you can use. And the best part is that's completely free. It's open source for anyone to use. And so we're really also now launching our tailored service packages that we added on to this knowledge base, so that we can also offer more hands-on approach to supporting the projects out there. Barrier number 2, it's the fact that there is a lack of funding solutions for the early stages for projects development. We hear a lot from projects that they're expected to develop high-quality projects co-designed with the local community and with all the co-benefits and good carbon models, but all that takes money. And the private sector is not ready to invest in those stages because it's perceived as very high risk before the project has been registered. So projects have very few solutions. They can either have to spend a lot of resources in finding small amounts of grants that don't cover the full costs, or they have to enter in these agreements where they maybe sell off half of their carbon credits for the duration of their lifetime at very discounted prices, or they just give up. So what we've done is we developed the Blue Catalyst Fund, which is launching in the next few weeks. And we're aiming to provide a very exhaustive program that takes projects from pre-feasibility all the way up to developing the PDD, which is a required document for them to register and validate their project with carbon standards. We do that by providing projects with technical assistance and support for implementation on the ground. We provide projects with early stage funding in the form of recoverable grants. And they also get transaction and financial advisory support to then negotiate the best investment deal once they're ready for implementation. And the magic in all this is that we're trying to make this into a permanent revolving fund whereby the projects that are successfully connected to follow-on investment would reimburse the grant they received, and this allows us to continuously run more cohorts and have like a form of permanent infrastructure in the market. And the final barrier number 3 is the regulatory complexity that surrounds the sector. The regulations in this sector are constantly changing and are very hard to keep up with. The land tenure and the carbon rights in this area between land and sea are also quite hard to secure. And there is a lack of common framework for national implementation. So what we're doing right now is that we developed a blue carbon enabling conditions index that we share in the form of country profiles and an interactive dashboard. Again, it's fully free and available on our website, and it can be used by governments to improve the way they're shaping their national legislation. It can be used by investors to basically determine where they're going to invest, or it can be used by projects to understand how they should work with the local government in their region. So these are some of the things we're doing. We're obviously trying to also be integrated in the broader ecosystem of things that are going on in mangroves and blue carbon space, like the Mangrove Breakthrough Alliance or the work Nick is doing at Conservation International as well, and you're going to hear from him now. So yeah, I would love to hear your questions and stay tuned with what we're doing.
Thank you very much, Alexia. Next up is Tom Birbeck, who is the founder and CEO at Arc Marine, an eco-engineering company founded in 2015, which designs, manufactures, and deploys innovative nature-based solutions in the offshore and coastal environment. mission is to restore marine habitats and biodiversity by accelerating reef creation on an unprecedented global scale. Tom.
Thanks, Brad. Hi, everybody. So my name's Tom. I actually live about 40 minutes from here, so it's really quite nice to be able to do this so close to my hometown. Normally, I've got to go all over the world. So today I'm going to talk very briefly about the company that I started 10 years ago, the technology, and about the projects that we're involved in, which are really, really exciting. But to start with ARC, so I started the company about 10 years ago. My background is commercial diving predominantly, so mainly inshore civils, offshore aquaculture. And it was during the early stages of my career where I had witnessed firsthand reef degradation, trawled seabeds, which since the David Attenborough film, a lot of people are seeing now, but also a lot of man-made infrastructure, which was going into the marine environment, which actually with a few tweaks on the materials and the design could be actually a benefit to the marine environment. And so we started ARC Marine really to accelerate reef creation on a scale that had never been done before. And the first hurdle we hit was funding of those projects. It was like knocking on a door, and everyone loved what we were doing, but no one had any money, especially in the UK and Europe. So what we thought was the vision for ARC was, how do we enable every offshore energy developer, coastal defense project to actually leverage the budgets they have to create a nature-based solution or a nature-inclusive design as part of their project? And then suddenly you're going to open up the doors to all these potential paying customers. And so what ARC predominantly does is four main things. We do an eco-centric design service. So we have developers come to us and say, we've got this wind farm and we want to be careful about cod or oyster habitats. What can we do there? And so we'll help create a mitigation strategy or help design a specific structure. We then actually do the monitoring. So we carry out baseline field work. So going out, collecting sediment samples, eDNA, ROV footage, and then also post-installation. So understanding what we've actually done to alter the environment from our treatment. And then we actually manufacture and deploy the nature-based solution. So the products that we've got, and I'll show you soon, can be manufactured anywhere in the world. The team is currently in Senegal at the moment, delivering a project for BP, where we're making just under 1,000 ton of reef units to go down to help mitigate an LNG project that they're building out there. And then finally, an impact assessment. So a lot of the developers, a lot of our customers want to know, well, what have we actually done in terms of moving the needle in terms of biodiversity? So that can be, how do you conform to marine net gain or biodiversity net gain policy, that sort of thing. But to focus on specific problems, this one was the one that really got us. So not many people realize, but for every subsea cable, pipeline, foundation that is around the UK and the world, you have to protect it. And so a lot of the products they use are pretty crappy. They're plastic bags filled with rocks, they're artificial seaweed, they're concrete mats with polypropylene rope. Not only are they really bad for the environment, but they're really expensive to remove and decommission. So much so that a lot of the developers just keep kicking the can down the road. They don't really want to have to recover this. It's extremely expensive and hard. And so we thought, right, with a few tweaks, we can change this product, and then actually we've got a customer. And to give you an idea of the scale, the mattress product you see there in the middle at the bottom, there's 80,000 of those on the UK seabed itself, predominantly from oil and gas. They cost about £1,000, but it's about £13,000 to £15,000 to remove it from the seabed, and then they end up in landfill. So it's a huge decommissioning liability that sits on the balance sheet of these developers. And so really they want to have a nature-based solution that they can leave on the seabed, have a positive legacy, and hopefully save some money. And there's a few oil companies spend between 10 and 15 million pounds a year procuring those. So we think that is the perfect sort of customer, if you like, to be able to start buying reefs. So very quickly, our main flagship product is the Reef Cube. It's made of a low carbon concrete. So the cement binder was actually developed with the University of Exeter. So we work closely with them. So we work closely with the materials lab on something called an AACM, alkali activated cementitious material. It takes the waste from a steel mill or a coal power station, mixes it with a chemical activator, and then you get 91% less carbon than Portland cement. It meets all the leachate standards for environmental credentials, so really safe to be used in the environment. And then as you can see from the funky textures we've got on there, we actually 3D print those. So that could be anything really. We can use biomimicry. We can take photogrammetry of existing reefs or coral, whatever it may be, and actually put that into a formliner and then print that onto the side of the cube. And we can frag stuff. So we've been doing oyster transplantation, kelp spores, and all that sort of stuff. Predominantly used in subsea environments, but we can also do intertidal. So we've been putting these around the UK coast, Cornwall, Hengistbury Head, and soon to be Ireland, where they actually sit in the intertidal zone. Range in sizes from about 30 centimeters, yay high, up to 1.5 meters, weighing 6 ton. And we've got designs for 12-ton units as well. So also acting as moorings, subsea breakwaters, that sort of thing. And the second product that we've been developing is the mattress. So this is a low carbon equivalent to what you've seen on the previous slide. And we've been playing around with some really novel materials like basalt rope, hemp rope, and looking at natural treatments. The paint itself is actually completely natural as well. So we've really gone to the detail of making sure there's nothing toxic on any of the products that go on the seabed. And as you can see from the image, that was after about 4 months of being subsea. And it looks a lot better than the previous ones. A little bit about this project that we're working on at the moment. So this is our vision, if you like, for how we can see our technology being used around offshore wind. We've just finished last week manufacturing 80,000 reef units of the 35 centimeter and the 50 centimeter size to go around a wind farm in the UK. So that's off Rampion Wind Farm with the wind developer RWE. And it's fully replacing the traditional technology that they previously would have used. So this is this is really a great industry first, if you like, where the developer has put in a huge amount of money and a huge amount of risk to go against the grain to adopt a nature-based solution. And it also proves that we can manufacture it at scale, and then we can work out what the price comparison is as well. But we've done the baseline. They're going to be down in August, September this year. And then hopefully the results will look a little bit like this. So this is from our previous project. So our oldest reef is about 7 years old now. And they continue to develop. So we've got 3 or 4 peer-reviewed papers that have come off the reef. So the biggest strength in ARC is our science and engineering team, whether they're working on stability analysis to make sure what size reef cube is suitable for what conditions, or what size reef cube will cater for what environmental species. So for the wind farm project that we're doing in the UK, it was black sea bream, whelk, and brown crab. So there's some tweaks made to the hull sizes. As you can see, we've got crabs living in them, and also for different size fish. That's it. That's what I've got. So yeah, happy to sit on the panel and answer any questions.
Thanks. It's inspiring to see solutions. Next up, we have Chris Pearce from the National Oceanography Center just up the coast, and also an official Ocean Visions partner for full disclosure. Chris and I work together. His research focuses on the assessment and evaluation of climate change mitigation strategies, including marine carbon dioxide removal, which is what I believe he'll talk about. And he's leading an EU project called CO2, SEAO2, CDR, which is working to develop some of the complicated governance arrangements that are going to be needed for MCDR if it ever scales. And he's also looking at those potential pathways to scale. Chris.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Brad. So I'm not going to pitch, promote, or advocate for any ocean-based carbon dioxide removal solution. However, I am going to sort of talk through some of these pathways that, Brad has already introduced, and they kind of got mentioned earlier through Paul and Nick's question, and really sort of highlight some of the considerations we need to factor in when weighing up if or how or where or when the oceans can be used as part of our climate mitigation pathways. So this is the figure that Brad showed in a slightly redrawn context, and it really underpins why we need to consider the oceans when it comes to looking at ocean carbon solutions. So, if you're in one of the other conferences happening this week, you will probably see this or a more updated version of this figure, given it's Friedenstein et al.'s annual reconstruction. But the key factor is over there on the right-hand side. You can see the size of the big blue dot, or turquoise dot in this case. That represents the dissolved ocean carbon pool, in this case, the DIC. This is many times larger than all the other carbon stores put together, really. It is the largest surface reservoir. We cannot consider manipulating or changing the global carbon budget without looking to the oceans. This has huge potential to help, therefore, leverage atmospheric CO2 concentrations. But we also need to factor in what, if or how, and when we do that, and what the consequences of it would be. So that's kind of what the oceans are doing naturally. They're already absorbing 10 gigatons worth of CO2 equivalents each year. They do that on their own by these natural organic and inorganic pathways. So they are hugely effective mechanisms. And we have pathways in which to accelerate or increase or replicate those pathways. So this is, again, a figure shown by Brad. Sorry, Brad, I should have known that you're going to show yours. So I think, as Brad highlighted, there are sort of two key approaches. I've actually put in a third, physical, but it's really chemical and biotic mechanisms for increasing the rate at which the oceans absorb carbon dioxide. The chemical approaches are sort of in the top side of this figure. We have I'm going to get them the wrong way around, ocean alkalinity enhancement over on this side. And then we have the direct ocean removal, ocean carbon capture, which Secure and other entities are looking at. So we can basically manipulate seawater chemistry to extract the CO2 that's dissolved within it, or to give it more buffering potential to absorb more from the atmosphere. Biological approaches, we just heard about coastal carbon mechanisms. There's also macroalgae, which are seaweeds. Can we stimulate the growth of these very rapidly growing organic reservoirs? And microalgae, so phytoplankton, often referred to as the lungs of the planet. Can we stimulate them through addition of nutrients? Physical approaches, we have artificial upwelling and downwelling. You can use pumps to basically force up the nutrient-rich waters to support the growth of these phytoplankton and other macroalgae, or you can use pumps to force down the DOC-enriched surface waters. All of these approaches have issues, whether it's energies, cost, material usage, environmental impacts, and all of them have potential benefits in terms of actually helping us tackle climate change. There is no magic bullet here. It's been said earlier this morning, it's going to be said again. We have to look at a portfolio of approaches. We have to understand what can be used where, to what extent, and how we're going to combine these and optimize these in our tackle against climate change. And that's really brings me on to the crux of what I want to talk about here, which is what factors do we need to be considering when we look at the oceans? Okay, so I think it's well established that there is scientific uncertainty. Okay, some of these, how effective are these approaches at drawing down CO2? How long does CO2 stay down there? How big can this approach get? These are sort of the questions that we think about when we look at the oceans. Yeah, the ocean covers 70% of Earth's surface. You can't apply any of these approaches over all of that area. You have to limit what you can do where and when. And part of that limitation will tie into the technological capabilities. Paul mentioned earlier, if you want to use direct ocean removal and get it to a gigaton scale, which the Elon Musk X Prize Foundation was kind of highlighting as the go-to for the current challenges, then you'd have to be looking at removing carbon from the entire Gulf Stream. So it kind of, some of this becomes limiting in terms of the scale that each of these approaches can reach. Environmental impacts, again, another critical consideration. The oceans are sensitive environments, but they will be impacted by climate change if we take no action. So how can we weigh the benefits of implementing marine carbon dioxide removal against the consequences of taking no action? And just to highlight, I'm actually working on another Ocean Visions funded project together with Fugro and Integral, where we're actually starting to develop a unified environmental impact assessment framework, which will try and give us the ability to assess on a sort of broad scale these different impacts and what they might be. There's also this term MRV. It may have already come up this morning. I haven't heard it too much, but it is, again, it's critical when we're looking at how we use the oceans in space. If you want to sell carbon credits, you've got to demonstrate the CO2 gets absorbed. And that is more complicated in the oceans because it has to dissociate in the CO2 in the atmosphere has to dissociate into seawater or get trapped into the organic carbon. So we have this kind of complexing factor there. Again, I think the same Paul highlighted, we can actually measure this exchange of carbon. We can do it on a localized basis. We can track where the carbon ends up. It's just really, really expensive to do that. So I think we need to sort of understand what scales do we want to do this MOV? What are the regulators going to be accepting of? What the market's going to be accepting of? What the public going to be accepting of? Where do we need to get to on our MOV capabilities? And at what extent, at what point can we hand off with our degree of satisfaction with the uncertainties associated with that? Governance considerations are perhaps another key blocker, and that's why I asked Paul the question about, whether this is a commercial or private-led entity. Mainly because at present time, there are restrictions on what can and can't be done with permits. So the London Convention under Protocol is one of perhaps the best known because it has direct implications for implementation of marine CDR. That at present only allows these types of activities to be done for scientific purposes only, although it is a non-binding agreement. Okay, people have signed up to it, but it's not legally enforceable. So we need to recognize that and work with our regulatory bodies to understand if and how and where we can do these, under what circumstances, and at what point we can hand off to market for selling credits. Ethically, again, the issue in the UK, just a few miles down the road in St Ives, this got brought to attention when Planetary, a company, tried to run a field trial without appropriately engaging with the community in advance. What they were trying to do scientifically was absolutely fine. Very small scale, the type of in situ study that has to be done. But they learned a lot of lessons, and actually the community as a whole learned a lot of lessons about how we need to engage with the communities that are going to be impacted and associated with this type of implementation. And somewhat intentionally, I've highlighted the pack for flashpoints. When you look at this geopolitically, Paul's already highlighted again that the North Sea is a really good place to do some of these approaches. Yeah, it's also a very clouded space when you look at the number of countries with EEZs in that area. Okay, if you want to work internationally, you still have to abide by your country's and national priorities and legislation. So we have to consider these implications. We have to look at that and work out what the current's going to do. Are you going to benefit a downstream country? Are you going to disadvantage them by moving fish stocks or aquaculture? So we need to look into that and consider what the implications might be. More broadly, things I'm not going to touch on too, we need to look at the implementation pathways. What will it take to get to scale? What's the best places to do this from? This, again, particularly becomes important when we're looking at co-location. At present, a lot of these techniques are being developed in the global north. We have the capabilities, the technologies, the infrastructure to start looking at these approaches, yet we touch a very small proportion of the global ocean. We have to look at sites of implementation, starting with the global south. If we're going to rely on ports, we're going to rely on their EEZs, their points of access to many of the global oceans. We need to engage with them now and say, is this going to be acceptable? Because even if we tick all the other boxes in terms of scientific potential and the costs and legal requirements, if a community says no, then it's not going to happen, and we need to understand that. And finally, of course, the market. Funding's been mentioned. At present, all of the ocean CDR approaches are being led by and funded through the VCM. Again, this is something that's highlighted in the State of CDR report. There is no compliance market for these approaches at present, and investors are worried, are limited by the uncertainties associated with marine techniques. We have the potential to advance that. It has the power to be a significant player in a tackle against climate change, but we cannot advance that if we're relying on VCM and private investment. So Brad introduced the CO2 CDR project. This is a Horizon-led program with 14 partner institutes, which is aimed to tackle some, but not all, of those challenges. We're really looking at what it would take to implement socially acceptable, environmentally effective, and economically viable marine CDR techniques. We have 3 core themes, which more or less align with the framework that I was just introducing. So this is primarily looking at scientific and technical requirements to deliver marine CDR, the governance considerations associated with it, as well as those implementation pathways. In sort of taking this forward, again, I'm very happy to answer questions about the project and what we're doing. I think there are sort of 4 key aspects we need to consider if we want to look at marine CDR implementation. Firstly, we absolutely have to get out of the labs and into the real environments. We cannot start to tackle some of the scientific uncertainties if we're not running small-scale controlled in situ evaluations. At present, some of that is being done by projects like Secure, by commercial entities, but we need to do more of that in different environments to really understand the scalability. Secondly, in terms of our ethical frameworks, we need to work with regulators. We need to work with members of the publics and the pathways to better understand what is going to go where. And we also need to basically make sure that marine CDR is starts to be included in our IPC scenario pathways, in the State of CDR report. If we're not talking about it, it's not going to be part of it. And there is at present a disconnect between the scientific interest and the policy and legislative framework. So we need to sort of help bridge that gap. And finally, funding. There is this dilemma. If you're reliant on private sector investment and VCM investment, then they need to see it's going to work. But you can't prove it will work until you've got the underpinning science. Marine CDR sits behind the gap when it comes to terrestrial-based approaches or atmospheric-based approaches, but there is enough interest and enough need to do that work that we need to get it funded now. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Nick Hardman Mountford, who is a policy specialist, marine scientist, and former diplomat working at the interface of oceans, climate, and nature. He leads the Blue Climate team at Conservation International and focuses on climate resilience for coastal communities. He was previously head of ocean and natural resources at the Commonwealth Secretariat and has worked on the Commonwealth Blue Charter and the APIA Commonwealth Ocean Declaration. Nick.
Thank you, Brad. Is that microphone the right level? Can you hear me okay? That's good. And just Christopher, thank you for just sharing, the level of uncertainties in the research we've got to do into this. I'm reminded of the poet Pablo Neruda, who said, "I need the sea, it teaches me." And we all need to recognize the amount of things we've still got to learn from the ocean. So I'm going to talk you through a bit of a learning journey that the international community has been on since about 2010 around blue carbon ecosystems, and very much, so we've heard a lot about this already, but so I'm going to take maybe a bit broader and beyond just the carbon projects, but just to give you an idea of what blue carbon ecosystems are, we're really talking about seagrass meadows, salt marshes, and mangroves. And as we've already heard, they can store carbon at 4 to 10 times the rate of terrestrial forests. So some figures here, I'm in about 500 tons of CO2 per hectare in seagrass, similar amounts, 200 to 600 per hectare for salt marshes, and then, sort of 900 to 1100 tons of CO2 per hectare for mangroves. Those sort of really significant levels of sequestration. What does this mean for us in tackling climate change? Well, first of all, how can they store so much carbon? Very much when people look at forest carbon, they're looking at the standing stock of forests, what's in the wood, what's in the trees themselves. But wetlands store a lot in the soils beneath them. And these soils, because they're permanently wet and low oxygen, carbon sits there and doesn't break down and get back into the atmosphere in the same way that it does when it's exposed to oxygen and when it dries out. And so we end up with these deep layers of carbon that build up over time, stored beneath these wetlands. And so when we look at the carbon sequestration potential of these ecosystems, we're looking not just at mangrove trees, but we're looking at all these sediments that are stored over time. And of course, these blue carbon ecosystems really, they have so many more benefits than just carbon. And it's very easy when we get into carbon discussions to really focus very much on this as though it's this is the new carbon economies conference, right? And so carbon's the currency we're using now, and we focus on that. But actually, these benefits are what the local communities rely on. These are where we really see the value. And so carbon can be a beneficial conversation, or it can be a distraction, depending on how we frame it. The biodiversity support is obvious, the shelter, food, and nurseries for marine life, the fish nurseries in mangrove roots and the crabs and the shrimp that live there and everything. But they also provide livelihoods through fishing, through harvesting, through aquaculture opportunities in those environments. The roots of mangroves are incredibly beneficial at stopping wave action. And if you've ever seen the sort of wave modeling of mangrove ecosystems, and you see these huge waves coming in, and then they hit the mangroves, and the other side of the lagoon is flat, because they have such amazing power to stop that wave energy. So in terms of protecting coastlines, preventing erosion, preventing sea level rise damage, and then the inundation and salination of farmland. all these things. Mangroves can help protect against coral reefs as well. We were just sort of looking at the concrete blocks. You can really, nature's built these limestone blocks along coastlines that protect coastlines from erosion, from storm damage. So one of the things we need to really recognize is that nature is infrastructure as well, and that we're not just looking at these as environmental, soft, fluffy stuff, which I know I'm talking to this audience, you don't, but so often in the policy sphere, in the finance sphere, that is how it's seen. And so this is serious infrastructure we're talking about. And of course, ocean health, the climate benefits we've been hearing about, the amount of carbon dioxide the ocean takes up, the processing of oxygen and nutrients, and the thermoregulation of the planet, everything the ocean provides. So we need to look at blue carbon ecosystems more holistically. But unfortunately, they are under decline, and we look at the threats. About half of salt marshes, about a third of mangroves, and about a third of seagrass have been degraded or lost over the past 75 years. So we're fighting a losing battle here. So just to pin down those numbers a bit more about how important is blue carbon for climate mitigation, if we were to prevent just 1% of mangrove loss, it would result in the equivalent of about 200 million tons of carbon being locked away. And if we were to restore the losses just since 1996, that could safeguard carbon in soil and above ground biomass equivalent to 1.27 gigatons of CO2. 1.25 billion tons of CO2. That's just the losses since 1996. If we were to store half of the restorable area of mangroves globally, which is a big ask, but it could result in an additional 25 billion commercial marine fish and shellfish and benefit 1 million small-scale fishers and countless communities that rely on mangroves to their livelihoods. So there's co-benefits there as well. So this is the journey we've been on since about 2010. I'm not going to describe this slide now, but it's in the pack for you to look at later. But really, there was an awakening in the scientific community that if we could tap into this carbon sequestration, there could be some climate solutions in it. In 2010, by the time we got to the Paris Agreement in 2015 and COP21, the International Partnership for Blue Carbon was formed, and then as we've gone on, that whole area of developing blue carbon ecosystems as a climate solution has progressed. And a few things that just off the end of this slide that haven't happened yet was, you'll see the International Blue Carbon Institute is one of our institutes in Conservation International, run out of Singapore, which really provides the science and capacity building and network development to address a lot of the knowledge gaps in blue carbon. In 2023, the Mangrove Breakthrough was launched as well. The Mangrove Breakthrough is a program to get $4 billion of investment into mangroves. You had Nigel Topping here last night. I'm sure he was talking about it as well. So that was a very significant moment as well. And the policy development has also been significant. I'm a big believer from time at the Commonwealth in using policy frameworks to set the parameters within which the private sector and communities and science know how to operate and provide that certainty. And so Brazil last year in July signed into force its Pro-Mangazal Decree, which is all about protection of mangroves. And it's a framework policy, and now we're working with them to implement that as well. And so that was work Conservation International did with the Brazilian government to help them develop this. So I want to just talk very quickly about the innovative financing that is now coming in. This is really, I think, what is key to driving success in this area, is we've got to get the finance flowing. So Mangrove Breakthrough, I don't know if Nigel talked about it last night, is looking at a mangrove bond. Carbon crediting is important, but so is insurance and bringing those credits and the insurance into bond structures. Not all the market-based approaches to protecting blue carbon ecosystems have to be carbon market. So we've got a program called BC Plus, Blue Carbon Positive Business Models, which is looking at non-carbon market but market-based approaches for protecting blue carbon ecosystems. To make that more tangible, I'm going to tell you about a project with Salicornia. Salicornia is sometimes called pickleweed. It's the thing in the salt marshes along the Atlantic coast that goes pink in summer. It can be animal feed, it can be human food, it can produce pharmaceuticals. Where are these business models? How do we invest in them and use those to protect these carbon sequestering ecosystems? And of course, investing in nature as infrastructure is absolutely critical, and getting the big pension funds, those who are comfortable with infrastructure, to not have to think about a new asset class, but just a new material. Instead of building with concrete, we're building with wood, living wood, that is self-sustaining, lower maintenance, and easy for you to invest in. Okay. I'm not going to talk about this one because you had a great talk on this by my colleague Maria Claudia last year, and it's still on your website. So, but this was the first and one of the really sort of groundbreaking blue carbon projects that set the tone on what high quality blue carbon credits look like. So I encourage you to go back and look at that presentation again. And of course, where do we go next? Seagrass. So many gaps associated with seagrass blue carbon, but we just got a paper out in Nature that's really compiled the global data set on seagrass carbon stocks for the first time. And so starting to work with NASA on mapping, getting that data into the databases and building a science network around that. And so I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. See over there. We don't have very much time, unfortunately, but I think we have time maybe for one or two questions. Okay, we have about 12 minutes. Anybody like to ask a general or a specific question? Yes.
Well, let's share us just a sense of magnitude in terms of the carbon efficacy of blue carbon, macro carbon that you worked on. What is that in terms of dollars per ton CO2? Just again get a sense of scale that say the other ones we've heard about today.
Do you want to go? So you're asking about the price per ton?
Yeah, what cost?
The so it's the thing in nature-based solutions is that it's so context dependent. I know it's an answer we don't like, right? But it's very context dependent. It depends on the country you're implementing it. It depends on the types of restoration efforts or conservation efforts. Conservation is cheaper, but the price of conservation credits is lower because people right now, the market is more into removals than conservation, although the biodiversity value is lower. But so it really is a context dependent, because if you have to do hydrological changes to the area with changing the channels and digging, it might be very expensive. If it's just about stopping the current source of degradation and protecting the area or helping the local improve the local livelihood so that they don't need to go into the mangrove area, it can be quite cheap. So it's very context dependent. If we're talking about the price of carbon credits, there's been a recent analysis done by Earth Security, really good report, by the way. They found that the average price right now is at $20 a ton, but actually they are seeing some that say that there's some studies that demonstrated that if you had the whole picture of the impact of the whole co-benefits, as we were talking, the carbon credit price would be $417 the ton. So there's a huge room for improvement in the price per ton. Yeah, Nick.
So let's move on to the
So I'll just briefly add a couple of other numbers to that. So if we're looking at the carbon sequestration potential, 1 square mile of mangroves can sequester as much carbon, or can hold as much carbon as the annual emissions of 90,000 cars. So that gives you something maybe a bit more tangible around that. As evidence on what you were just saying about the co-benefits. So Vida Manglar project I just showed it's an amazing project working with local communities in Colombia to protect these mangroves and protect biodiversity at the same time. And so because it has all those co-benefits built in, we don't need additional credits for biodiversity, additional credits for social value. They are included in the carbon price. So whereas most carbon crediting projects might go for $5 a ton, 10, if you're lucky, these were going for 30. And we're hoping to do another release later this year, which we think we might get up to $70 a ton because those benefits are already included. And then there's the potential to get up to the hundreds as well. So hope that helps.
Did you have a question back there? I thought you were holding the mic.
Yeah, I was saying I will bring the mic to people.
Oh, you would bring the mic
Yeah.
to people. Okay, sorry. I thought you wanted to ask a question.
Trying to subtly let you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a couple other over here then. Let's make the questions short and the answers short because we have
Martin?
about 6 minutes.
Really short. So this is a question about scaling and scaling within sort of the time that we have to make a real difference to it. So each of you gave great presentations and, you know, really good stuff. But how much of a contribution realistically do you think these technologies can have within the time frame of 30 years?
Maybe start with the two folks who just didn't speak.
Yeah, I think it's worth highlighting that they're not going to solve anything. Actually, we have to decarbonize. I think the ocean has huge potential, as we highlighted, but it's going to be hard to implement that, certainly by the 2040 target deadline. So it will be part of the solution, but not that much in the near term, unless we have massive ramp up in investment and scientific knowledge gains. So it has potential, but I wouldn't say we're talking gigatons at this point in time. Hopefully that might change.
I think in terms of habitat potential in the next 30 years, I think there's an estimated 25,000 monopiles that could be installed if everybody met their targets. And I mentioned that around that monopile, one monopile, there's 80,000 reef cubes. So that I think does have the chance to move the needle in terms of habitat created in a meter squared volume. In terms of bringing back commercial fish stocks and species, I think the jury's out until we have a bigger sample size, really, to be able to tell on a bigger scale.
Let me just add one thing. There's absolutely no plan by any international body on how we're going to get the amount of gigatons of carbon removal that I've laid out that the IPC has called for, IPCC, right? So that was 7 to 10 by 2050. There is no credible plan on the part of any international governance body to do that. And there's been no real analysis of what the trade-offs are between all of the different pathways, terrestrial and oceanic. And that is clearly needed. And if Nigel was here, that would have been one of the first questions I would have asked him is why has the UN failed to act on this, which is enshrined in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement?
This is for Chris and Brad, I think. I was wondering why you didn't include sediment in your diagram and the role that will play.
You mean in that diagram of ocean-based storage? A lot of that 50 or 37,000 gigatons is in sediments at the bottom of the sea.
So the bit where the more we stir up the sediment, sorry, Paul, then we're filling up the ocean with the CO2 and then reducing its capacity to absorb more from the atmosphere, that kind of bit. That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, so I think the DIC pool is actually in the dissolve. There are other circles on there that refer to the solid phase. I think we're talking about exchangeable pools. Sediment is less exchangeable if you're talking about remineralized carbon, neighbor carbon. But I think the key thing is here, the figure showing marine carbon dioxide removal processes. Sediments aren't removing carbon; it's already been removed. And so absolutely they become a source of carbon. If you're degenerating blue carbon salt marshes, they can re-release CO2, methane, other gases back up into the atmosphere. Sediment, when it gets resuspended, it becomes remobilized. It can be eaten again and re-release CO2 back to the atmosphere. So they are already a carbon store. They're not a carbon removal mechanism. So I think that's a nuance here. We absolutely have to preserve them, stop dredging, and stop suspending the sediments. We have to look at the carbon stores in near coastal environments, protect them to avoid them becoming carbon sources, but they are not really viable, scalable solutions as a carbon removal mechanism.
So just to end, I want to ask each person, as has been done previously, for one sentence of what you want the audience to take away from your participation here. And we'll just go down the line here. Start with Nick.
We're not going to get all the solutions in one package. So we've got to look at everything. And we've also got to look at what problems we're solving for. So carbon sequestration is part of the problem, but there's also adaptation, and adaptation for people who are living with the impacts of climate change. Very much coastal ecosystems can play a role in both of those, both as infrastructure and support for livelihoods, as well as in terms of sequestering carbon.
One sentence. Technology is great, but I would encourage us all to have a little more faith in nature and what it can deliver for all of the SDGs that we have to achieve and all the human potential we have to achieve.
Mine would be that we have nature-based solutions available today that can be used, and it's our job as consumers of the energy, consumers of ports, harbors, whatever we're getting, to put pressure onto the developers to use nature-based solutions as standard where possible.
Yeah, the final word. The oceans are already dealing with our waste. They're removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If or when or how we can accelerate the rate at which they're doing that requires further research, but they have to be part of the solution if we're going to look to tackle climate change in any time soon.
All right, not the final word, because I get to answer this too. So here's mine. There is no path to net zero, absolutely no path to net zero without massive carbon removal. And that's not my opinion. That is in every model run of the IPCC. And net zero is not a tenable ending place for our climate journey. That's peak carbon. We need to come back from that. And there's absolutely no path to restoring 350 parts per million and below without massive amounts of carbon removal. So as you think about the new carbon economy, don't forget about carbon removal at massive scale. Please join me in welcoming or thanking the panel.